Tonight, 13B cartel empire meets U.S. Navy power at the border. Then this happened.
At 11:47 p.m., federal agents executed the largest coordinated takedown of a drug cartel operation ever witnessed on United States soil. What they uncovered was not just a criminal enterprise. It was a $13 billion shadow government. An entire parallel state apparatus built to move narcotics, exploit vulnerable people, and corrupt the institutions sworn to protect us. Over the next 24 hours, more than 2,000 federal agents, SWAT teams, naval personnel, and special forces would converge on a single region. What they found would change how America understands power, infiltration, and the cost of silence. This is how a cartel fortress was built. This is how it was torn down. The night started cold and quiet in the desert towns of southern New Mexico. Fog rolled off the Rio Grande in thick, suffocating blankets. The kind of fog that hides movement, that hides everything. By 2:15 a.m., every major street light in the border city of San Rafael had been cut. Not by accident, by design. Teams of DEA agents in black tactical gear had already positioned themselves at 17 separate locations across a 30-mile corridor. FBI SWAT units moved through the fog like ghosts, their body cameras recording every step, every breach, every moment of what was about to unfold. The first target was a sprawling industrial complex on the eastern edge of San Rafael, near an abandoned cotton processing plant. On paper, it was registered as a logistics distribution center for agricultural equipment. In reality, it was a drug superlab, a fortress designed to process 300 kilograms of cocaine, heroin, and methamphetamine every single week. The agents knew this because they had been watching. For 18 months, they had watched. At 2:34 a.m., the breach team moved. Flashbangs detonated inside the main warehouse. The sound echoed across the empty desert like distant thunder. Agents in tactical vests poured through the shattered doors, their weapons raised, their movements synchronized to the precision of a military operation. Inside, they found what they expected and something they did not. Rows upon rows of processing equipment. Industrial-grade pill presses the size of cars. Heating chambers. Extraction tanks. Enough equipment to supply half the drug markets in the western United States. Agents moved through the maze of machinery, securing suspects who tried to run. Some threw duffel bags toward the back exits. Bags heavy with cash. Bags filled with narcotics. All of it was seized within minutes. The numbers staggered even veteran agents. 2.3 tons of processed cocaine, 480 kilograms of heroin, 1.9 million counterfeit fentanyl pills, cash in 18 different currencies totaling $47 million. But the real discovery came from the back office. An agent named Martinez, with 12 years in the DEA, found a steel box welded beneath the concrete floor. Inside were not just ledgers. They were encrypted hard drives, server backups, and something more dangerous than any drug shipment: authorization documents, official government seals, procurement orders signed by people whose names would later shake the entire state. This box changed everything. While the San Rafael Superlab was being emptied, simultaneous raids erupted across the region. In the wealthy hills outside the city of Coronado, a sprawling mansion with reinforced doors and underground tunnels was breached by FBI tactical teams. Agents found a command center, computer servers, satellite phones, and more importantly, a ledger that would later be called the Throne Book, a book containing the names and payment schedules of every corrupted official, every compromised cop, every judge, and every politician who had been feeding the machine. Inside that mansion, they also found something that would haunt investigators for weeks: photographs, thousands of them, images of federal agents at cartel safehouses, images of state police commanders receiving cash payments, images of a U.S. Border Patrol supervisor shaking hands with a man identified as the cartel's chief logistics coordinator. 53 miles away, on the outskirts of the farming community of Deming, ICE agents and Department of Homeland Security teams descended on what appeared to be a migrant processing center. In reality, it was a human trafficking hub, a facility where vulnerable migrants were held, their families extorted, their bodies sold into forced labor. This was not just a criminal operation. This was systematic exploitation operating under the protection of corrupted local authorities. Agents found records indicating that over 800 people have been processed through this single facility in the past year alone. 800 exploited lives, and above them all, a network of officials who profited while looking away. By 4 a.m., the first wave of raids had yielded a haul that would take months to fully catalog. But the real story was not in the drugs or the money. The real story was in the digital trail. 6 hours later, inside an underground federal forensics facility 40 miles north of the main operations, a team of FBI cyber specialists began the work of decryption. The lead analyst was a woman named Sarah Chun, 15 years with the Bureau, decorated for her work on organized crime networks. When she finally broke through the encryption on the primary server at 10:42 a.m., she went silent. Her supervisor, Special Agent David Corman, watched her face. He had seen that expression before. It was the look of someone who had just glimpsed something that changes how they understand the world. On the screen before them was a network diagram. It had a code name, Operation Fortress Crown. The diagram showed not just a drug cartel. It showed something far more sophisticated. A shadow financial system operating in plain sight. Shell corporations registered in Delaware. Cryptocurrency wallets moving money across the globe in transactions totaled at over $2 billion per month. Fake non-profit foundations that filtered cartel proceeds through tax-exempt status. Restaurant chains that laundered cash through inflated sales records. Logistics companies that moved drugs alongside legitimate shipments. A trucking contractor that had government contracts to transport critical supplies, and used those same trucks to move cocaine from the Mexican border to distribution hubs in Phoenix, Denver, and Los Angeles. But the diagram showed something else. Something that made Chen's hands shake as she reached for the phone to call her supervisor. At the center of the network, connected by encrypted authorization keys and digital signatures to every major operation, was a single name: Governor Harrison Blake. Governor Blake had been in office for 8 years. He had built a reputation as a law and order politician. He had funded border security initiatives. He had given speeches about fighting drug trafficking. He had even commissioned a task force to investigate cartel penetration in state agencies. All the time, he was penetrated. All the time, he was the command center. The evidence accumulated like an avalanche. Digital transfers from shell companies to Blake's campaign accounts. Encrypted communications between Blake and identified cartel operatives. Procurement orders for new equipment and personnel at the drug superlab, all bearing Blake's encrypted authorization signature. But more than that, more damning than that, a master plan document titled Phase 3, Permanent Operations, which detailed Blake's vision for transforming the entire southwestern border region into a secure operational hub for the cartel. Not temporary, permanent. A vision where corrupted state and federal officials would form a permanent apparatus to protect drug trafficking, human smuggling, and money laundering for decades to come. This was not corruption. This was command-level collusion. This was not negligence. This was engineered treason. By 2:15 p.m., Chen's findings had reached the desk of FBI Director Patricia Hessler. By 3 p.m., the decision had been made. Operation Fortress Crown would move into its second phase. The governor would be arrested. The entire statewide apparatus would be dismantled. And for the first time in federal history, a sitting governor would face charges of cartel conspiracy, money laundering, human trafficking, and drug trafficking on a scale that surpassed most criminal organizations. But before any arrest could happen, they needed to move against every element of the network simultaneously. They needed to hit so hard and so fast that no one could warn anyone. They needed to move like an army. The command center for Operation Fortress Crown was established in the basement of the federal building in Albuquerque. Rows of tactical commanders, satellite specialists, DEA coordinators, FBI field leaders, ICE regional directors, and DHS personnel sat before a giant digital map. The map showed 47 red markers pulsing across New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, and Colorado. 47 identified cartel strongholds. 47 locations where the network operated with protection from corrupted officials. At 5:47 a.m., exactly 31 hours after the first raids, Deputy Director James Morrison stood before this map and gave the order. The order would deploy over 2,000 federal agents, 63 SWAT teams, 14 Black Hawk helicopters, 3 armed U.S. Navy vessels positioned in international waters off the California coast, 24 B-52 bombers on standby status, and 240 Border Patrol units across 6 states. This was not an operation. This was a war. The attacks began simultaneously at 6 a.m. across all 47 locations. In the desert outside Phoenix, DEA teams rappelled from helicopters directly into a cartel stronghold built into an underground tunnel network. The complex stretched for 3 miles beneath the Arizona desert, designed as both a drug storage facility and a human trafficking transit point. When agents flooded into the tunnels, they found over 200 people being held, men, women, and children, destined for forced labor or worse. They also found 560 kilograms of fentanyl, enough to kill the entire population of a major city, measured in doses. In Colorado, FBI teams hit a money laundering hub disguised as a high-end casino in a mountain resort town. They found servers containing transaction records for over $1.4 billion in cartel proceeds. They arrested 42 people, including the casino owner who held a valid gaming license and sat on the state casino regulatory board. A man whose official responsibility was to prevent money laundering in the very casinos he was using to launder cartel money. In Texas, ICE agents descended on a network of massage parlors and brothels operating across 3 major cities. These were not just human trafficking fronts. They were intelligence gathering points. Women and girls held in these locations had been forced to gather information about federal operations, border patrol movements, and law enforcement activities from clients. All of that intelligence had been funneled directly to cartel operatives. All of it had been used to time drug shipments, to avoid enforcement actions, to route human trafficking convoys through blind spots in border surveillance. In New Mexico, the focal point of the operation, multiple teams converged on Governor Blake's office, his private residence, and his campaign headquarters simultaneously. Blake was arrested at 6:12 a.m., just as he was preparing for a press conference where he was scheduled to announce a new border security initiative. The irony would not be lost on anyone. The man who had positioned himself as the state's chief defender against cartel violence was being led away in handcuffs as a conspirator with that very cartel. By 7:30 a.m., the seizures had begun to accumulate into numbers that staggered comprehension. 2.8 tons of cocaine, 1.2 tons of methamphetamine, 930 kilograms of heroin, 3.1 million fentanyl pills, $680 million in cash seized across all locations. 47 major drug production facilities were neutralized. 283 suspects were arrested, 78 cartel operatives captured, and something more important than any of those numbers: evidence. Overwhelming, irrefutable evidence. By noon, the underworld had taken more damage in 9 hours than it had in the last 6 years. But the real shock came when investigators began examining the arrested officials. In a secure federal detention facility, interrogators sat across from Deputy Sheriff Marcus Klein, a man who had served in the New Mexico State Police for 19 years. Klein broke down within the first hour. He explained how it had started. A bribe. A single bribe, just $50,000, to look the other way on a shipment that passed through his jurisdiction. Then another bribe. Then another. Until the bribes became routine. Until he was actively managing cartel operations. Until he was coordinating with other corrupted officers to disable surveillance cameras on specific dates when drug convoys were scheduled to pass. Until he was personally falsifying patrol records to create gaps in coverage. Until he had become not a police officer, but part of the cartel's security apparatus. He was not alone. Across the region, investigators found an intricate web of corruption. A federal border crossing supervisor who had been taking payments to wave through trucks without proper inspection. An Arizona state senator who had used her position to block legislation that would have funded additional border surveillance. A state judge who had dismissed cases against known cartel operatives on technicalities, ensuring they stayed on the street. A U.S. Customs and Border Protection commander who had been systematically leaking information about planned enforcement operations to cartel contacts. The scope of it was breathtaking. 137 officials across multiple agencies and jurisdictions had been directly compromised. Another 214 had been indirectly complicit through negligence, willful blindness, or coercion. What investigators were describing was not a cartel infiltrating law enforcement. It was a parallel law enforcement structure. A second police force operating in service to the cartel instead of the people. A shadow system designed to protect criminal operations while wearing the uniforms of legitimate authority. FBI Director Hessler stood before a press conference at 4 p.m. and made a statement that would reverberate across the nation. What we have uncovered is not criminal corruption in the traditional sense. What we have uncovered is an attempt to redesign state and federal institutions to serve organized crime. This was systematic, premeditated, and designed for permanence. The individuals involved did not stumble into this. They were recruited, they were trained, they were protected, and they were part of a long-term strategy to transform the government itself. Inside the detention facilities where corrupted officials sat in federal custody, there was a different kind of reckoning. Agent interviews with honest police officers revealed the psychological toll of working alongside conspirators. A Border Patrol agent named David Santos, 15 years with CBP, broke down during his debrief when he learned that his own supervisor had been leaking his operational plans to cartel handlers. The betrayal was not just professional, it was personal. It was a violation of the sacred trust that binds men and women in uniform. The trust that the person next to you will not sell you out, will not put you in danger for money. By the end of the first week of arrests, the message was clear. The institutions would be rebuilt, the badge would be honored again. But first, there would be accountability. Real accountability. The kind that sends a message through every law enforcement agency in the country. You cannot serve two masters. You cannot protect the people and the cartel. And if you try, you will answer for it. But Operation Fortress Crown had one more dimension. a dimension that revealed just how expansive the cartel's reach had become. Forensic analysts examining seized servers discovered something that shocked even veteran investigators. The network did not end at the state border. It extended across multiple states and into Mexico. Shipping manifests altered at ports in California. Way stations shut down for maintenance on predetermined dates when cartel convoys passed through. Cryptocurrency transfers routing through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Shell companies registered in 32 states. Fake agricultural grants funneling government money into cartel-controlled operations. A network so vast and so carefully constructed that it had achieved something remarkable. It had become invisible. Or rather, it had been invisible until now. What analysts discovered was that the cartel could move an average of 1.4 tons of narcotics per week through this network without triggering a single alert. Not because the network was undetectable, but because the network included the people whose job it was to detect it. The whole apparatus had been engineered to exploit a fundamental weakness in the American system. The assumption that institutions work as designed. The assumption that power operates within legal constraints. The assumption that the badge means something. Governor Blake's vision, laid out in the documents investigators seized, was chilling in its clarity. He had wanted to expand the network to another 5 states within 3 years. He had wanted to establish permanent, operational zones, where cartel logistics could move freely. He had wanted to embed corrupted officials so deeply into state and federal institutions that removing them would require dismantling the institutions themselves. In other words, he was trying to make the cartel too big to stop. He was trying to make it a permanent feature of American governance. The plan had a projected timeline. Phase 1, which had already been executed, was the infiltration and compromise of key institutions. Phase 2 was the expansion to multiple states and the integration with international operations. Phase 3, scheduled to begin, was the establishment of permanent operational sovereignty. In other words, Blake intended to create a situation where the cartel would no longer need to hide, where it would operate with such protection and such institutional integration that it would function as a parallel government. This was the nightmare scenario. Not a criminal organization stealing from society, but a criminal organization replacing society. The costs of what had been discovered were beginning to become clear. In a briefing room at the DEA's Albuquerque field office, analysts presented statistics that made the room go silent. In the 8 years that Governor Blake had been in power, fentanyl deaths in the region had increased by 347%. Cocaine-related emergency room visits had quadrupled. Methamphetamine addiction in the region's poorest neighborhoods had reached epidemic levels. Human trafficking cases had increased by 261%. Entire communities had been destabilized. Entire families destroyed. Entire futures stolen. The math was brutal. Operation Fortress Crown had dismantled a cartel apparatus that had been directly responsible for thousands of overdose deaths, thousands of broken families, thousands of exploited victims. But those victims were abstract numbers in reports. They were not sitting in the briefing rooms. They were in hospitals and morgues and prisons and homeless shelters. They were the visible cost of the invisible network. Special Agent Chun, the cyber analyst who had first discovered Governor Blake's involvement, visited a community center in San Rafael 2 weeks after the raids. She spoke with a mother named Rosa Garcia, whose son had died of a fentanyl overdose 3 years earlier. Rosa had not known, when her son bought drugs on the street, that those drugs were moving through a network protected by a state governor. She had not known that officials she had elected were profiting from her son's addiction. She had not known any of this. But now she did. "My son is gone," Rosa told Chin. "He's been gone for 3 years. But now I know that people in power knew what was happening. They knew, and they did nothing. They did worse than nothing. They protected it." Chun had no answer for Rosa. Because there was no answer. The system had failed. The institutions had been compromised. And the cost had been measured in lives lost and futures stolen. The national response to Operation Fortress Crown was swift and severe. President Morrison called a special address to the nation. In that address, he spoke about infiltration, about the dangers of institutional corruption, and about the need for systemic reform. "What we discovered in New Mexico represents a threat to the fundamental integrity of American democracy," the president said. "We have always understood organized crime as a problem that exists outside of government. But this investigation reveals something more insidious. It reveals that organized crime can and will attempt to capture the government itself. It reveals that without vigilance, without integrity, without the willingness to stand against corruption even when it comes from our own institutions, democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires constant defense." In response to the president's address, Congress fast-tracked new legislation. The Institutional Integrity Act, which mandated enhanced background checks for all federal and state law enforcement officials. The Border Security Accountability Act, which required real-time monitoring of all border operations and cross-referenced them against financial records of officials. The Cartel Disruption Act, which provided additional funding for cyber forensics and financial crime investigation. But even as new laws were passed, investigators continued to dig, and what they found extended the investigation even further. In examining Blake's communications, they discovered that Blake had not acted alone. He had been recruited by cartel operatives 5 years before he became governor. The recruitment had been sophisticated. Financial investors with apparent legitimacy had approached Blake's campaign when he was considering a run for office. They had provided funding. They had provided consultants. They had provided strategic advice. By the time Blake took office, he was already compromised. By the time he took the oath to protect and defend the Constitution, he had already betrayed it. This revelation sparked a nationwide investigation into how many other politicians at state and federal levels might be compromised in similar ways. The investigation was still ongoing as of this broadcast. The implications are still unfolding. Power, we are learning, does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes power only needs silence. Sometimes power only needs ambition. Sometimes power only needs someone willing to pretend not to see what is happening right in front of them. The cartels understand this. They understand that the most effective way to control a system is not to destroy it, but to infiltrate it, to make it work for you, to transform the institutions designed to stop you into institutions that protect you. This is the story of Operation Fortress Crown. This is the story of how a $13 billion drug empire built its way into the very institutions sworn to stop it. This is the story of how federal agents and dedicated law enforcement professionals broke that network apart. But it is also a warning. A warning about what happens when we fail to hold our institutions accountable. A warning about the price paid in overdose deaths and shattered families and communities left behind. A warning about how organized crime metastasizes when it finds fertile ground in corruption. Governor Blake now sits in federal custody awaiting trial. Deputy Sheriff Klein faces 37 counts of conspiracy and corruption. The cascade of arrests continues. But the real battle is not in courtrooms. It is a question that every citizen must ask themselves. What are we willing to accept from the institutions we create? What are we willing to allow in the name of order? What are we willing to ignore? The answer to those questions will determine whether Operation Fortress Crown represents a singular moment of corruption that has been corrected, or whether it represents merely one cell in a much larger organism that continues to grow. If you are still watching, if you are still paying attention to these stories of infiltration and corruption and institutional failure, then tap like so that more people see this warning. Comment expose if you believe this story needs to be dragged into the light and examined. Share this with someone you trust. Because the fight against systemic corruption is not a fight that happens in briefing rooms or courtrooms. It is a fight that happens in the collective consciousness of a nation that refuses to look away. This story is a fictional dramatization. The characters, the officials, the specific operations described here are creations designed to illustrate the real threat of cartel infiltration into government institutions. But the underlying reality is not fictional. Cartels do attempt to corrupt officials. Drug networks do infiltrate law enforcement. The institutions that protect us are vulnerable. And that vulnerability is not something we can afford to ignore. The only defense against the kind of corruption that Operation Fortress Crown revealed is relentless transparency, unwavering institutional integrity, and a public that remains vigilant. A public that refuses to look away. A public that demands accountability. A public that understands that power without oversight will always eventually serve itself. This is the lesson of Operation Fortress Crown. This is the warning we must hear.